This week on The Futurists, Roger Holzberg.
You know, it's always about the storytelling and the experience design and to some degree never about the technology.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with my co-host, Brett King.
Hey, Rob. Yeah, glad you're back.
I'm happy to be back.
Joining me back in the hosting chair. Not that Brian isn't a great co-host, but you know, it's you're the partner in crime. So, how was the trip?
It was a fantastic trip. I was on the East Coast, and I visited South Carolina, and then I was in New Mexico, which is a state I'm really growing fond of visiting. And while I was in South Carolina, I had a chance to go to the AR meetup in Charleston.
Charleston is quite a tech hub these days.
Yeah, it's growing real quick. There's a booming tech scene there. They've got they've got 3 tier 1 research universities in the state of South Carolina, and then the College of Charleston, which is a liberal arts school that's reinventing itself with an engineering and computer science department that is very cutting edge. And the cool thing there at all those schools I visited is that they're focused on practical education. So the students are also working with local industry. But along that line, I went to a meetup there, AR and VR meetup in Charleston, which is quite good. And they demoed the new Meta Quest Pro headset. And so I thought I'd start the show with a little bit of news from the future about very near future topics, since the Meta Quest Pro headset came out last fall. And the news story there is actually quite interesting. You know, for a lot of folks, the last time they tuned into VR was before the pandemic. You know, so around 2018, there was a mini boom in VR. Here in Los Angeles, where I'm based, there were several VR studios. And there was a big push towards immersive arcades, you know, so a destination, a shopping mall that you would go to. And of course, the pandemic put an end to most of that activity, and quite a few of the studios went away. So as a result, a lot of people have kind of a negative feeling about VR, kind of lingering doubt, pessimism about that field. And that's understandable because people have been grinding away at VR for a long time. So I was curious to see this new headset after, you know, Zuckerberg has invested tens of billions of dollars into what used to be Oculus and now is called the Meta Quest. The Quest is the headset. Before the pandemic, the Quest 2 came out, and at the time, it was the best VR headset on the market. But that was quite a few years ago. That was 2018. And so now here we are back to 2022, so just last fall. A new version came out. It's the Meta Quest Pro, and it retails at a whopping $1,500. It's a lot of money. It's 3 times the price of the Quest 2. And so I was so curious to try it on and see what's different. And here's the interesting thing. It's pretty good. Personally, I'm not going to
Coming from you, that's a big deal, man.
I know, exactly. That's it.
You're a bit of a skeptic on this stuff.
I'm a tire kicker, but I want it to work, right? So I approach it all with a little bit of skepticism, but also I'm kind of excited to try it on. So the headset is much lighter. The headset has a new pancake lens that's 40% thinner than the previous lens, which makes the front of it less heavy. If you remember the old VR headsets,
right. And
they were
have
kind
the
of front
battery
heavy.
in the back, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So they balanced it. There's a battery in the back, and then there's lighter lens in the front. And what that means is that you barely notice you're wearing it. So one of the complaints people often had about VR headsets is that they were too heavy, and you kind of noticed it when you were wearing it. I did not notice this thing at all because the battery tucks in right underneath at the back of your head. It's curved, and you barely notice it at all. So the weight and the distribution of weight is good. That the straps on the headset, that was the other big issue with the previous headsets. They would have an ugly strap that went across the top of your head. A lot of people didn't like that if they had a hairstyle. And so the new straps are on the side, and they're quite firm, and they sort of snap in. They hold it snug to your head. I found that was great as well. The lenses themselves are about almost 40% more pixels. So they're quite a bit better resolution.
Wow.
And they have this new thing, which is great. You can dial it. If you've ever used binoculars where you can adjust the resolution.
So, yeah.
Because I was stunned at how sharp the resolution was. And that was always my issue in the past with VR. It was always a little fuzzy for me. And I never felt like I was going to watch a movie in it. It would be a substandard experience. So the minute I put on the Meta Quest Pro, I was stunned because the resolution was quite good. But one of the things I noticed is that because I could adjust that little knob, which brings the lenses either closer or farther from your face for what they call interpupillary distance. That's the space between your eyes. What that does is that has the effect of making it sharper. And man, it was really quite a good image. Now, this new headset is designed for work. That's what it's intended for, hence the term pro. And they had all these work functions that were really kind of trippy. So, you probably remember when Mark Zuckerberg a couple of years ago was getting very excited about co-working in VR. And at the time, I was rolling my eyes. People are like, come on, Mark Zuckerberg is just hyping it up here. What's Facebook's play in work? It just seemed preposterous. But I'll tell you what's quite interesting is I created 3 virtual screens, like a virtual desktop. And it was pretty good. I don't know if it's good enough to replace my desktop screen, but the idea of multitasking.
But that's the trajectory, right? That's where we're going with this. And this is Apple's argument as well for the new AR glasses, or well, it looks like now, getting to the news that, and when by the time this show comes out, actually we may have the news, but they're talking about releasing this mixed reality headset, and holding off on the AR glasses.
That's right. I think they've canceled the AR for now, but Apple will have a toggle switch that allows you to go back and forth between AR and VR. Think of that as like the digital crown on your Apple Watch. Right. So like one tap and you can switch from one mode to the other. Both of them, the Apple headset, according to rumors, and then the MetaQuest Pro, can track facial gestures and your eyes, and thereby render your avatar with an expression that's similar to your face. And so, and that sounds really goofy. I can't believe I just said that sentence, but actually in practice, this works intuitively and it works quite well. The other interesting thing is you don't necessarily need to use controllers. If you use a VR unit now, you have to wear these little controllers on your hands. The MetaQuest Pro is able to track your hands, and you can be like controller free. And again, that's such a big change. It was sort of a surprise. And the last thing I'll share with you is pass-through. Pass-through is how you can do mixed reality.
Right.
So you could see things on your desk, for instance, your real desk, even as you're working at a virtual desk. And I got to tell you, this is trippy. It was super fun to experience. It's really weird because there's a little bit of like cultural adjustment necessary to work in a mixed virtual and real space. Man, I got to tell you, I had a blast. I don't think I'm going to spend $1,500 to buy one just yet, but there is a rumor that there's a new version of the Quest, the regular, consumer Quest coming.
But that's it. I mean, as this tech gets better, it's going to get cheaper. It's going to get more accessible. I mean, look at how many people could afford the first iPhone or the first Xbox or the first laptop computers, So,
every pundit has a habit of comparing this to the battle for the iPhone. And if you remember, there were a lot of terrible smartphones in the mid 2000s. I mean, they were super expensive, clunky like a brick. They didn't really do much. They didn't have color screens. But the real clincher for the iPhone wasn't the actual first iPhone. It was the App Store and the developer program. And that's where the battle is going to shift really soon. Now, Facebook has pretty terrible reputation.
It's not just the App Store, but it's the OS as well that comes with it, right? Because, like the two are tied together quite closely. And then increasingly, it's going to be the wallet ecosystem that sits in there as well. And, some of those supporting mechanisms, because, your ability to make a payment in VR seamlessly and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be integrated, in there as well as.
Yeah. And you'll hear that from people who've been road testing the MetaQuest Pro. They complain because a lot of apps aren't yet developed for the haptic interface or the hands-free interface. Right. And so they're having a tough time logging into the apps that they use on their computer, for instance. So the battleground is going to shift from hardware pretty quickly to developer program and availability of apps. And, Apple famously has a couple million apps in the App Store and a huge, vibrant ecosystem of developers. So all eyes are now on Apple's upcoming Worldwide Developer Conference, which is where they expect to be making the big announcements. But this battle of ecosystems will be quite interesting because I think Facebook is going to be in a tough spot there. They have never been kind to their developers. And while everybody in the world complains about that 30% toll that Apple charges on iPhone apps,
great developer partnership.
It turns out that Facebook is going to charge, or Meta will charge almost 50%.
It's like saying who's going to win, iOS or Android. I don't think, and I think there's room for a few different players in this.
Well, for sure. Yeah. Unfortunately, the way the news works these days, everything's like a sports event. Somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. I think you're right. There's room for multiple wins. But on that note, it's worth noting that there's a couple of other headsets that are notable. ByteDance, which is the company that owns TikTok and has been inflicting incredible pain on Facebook for the past 2 years, they recently bought a company called Pico, and they have a headset that's comparable, at least on paper.
Katie was talking about this the other day in the other show, right?
That's right, exactly. And then, of course, HTC, which is one of the first companies to come out with a VR headset. In November, they launched the XR Elite, so they have a new update to the Vive headset, and that has comparable specs, and it's only $1,000, so it's the cheapest of the bunch. I haven't checked those out yet. But I bring all this up because I thought it'd be a nice way to start our conversation today with our guest. Roger Holzberg is someone I've known for a long time. We were introduced ages ago by my friend Jay Shanker, who sent his regards. And Roger was at Disney Imagineering at the time. He's a director at Disney Imagineering. Now, Brett, for our listeners who might not know, Disney Imagineering is really like the department of the future. It's where Disney invents the future. So we'll ask Roger about that. But since that time, he's had a big life change and an epiphany, and he's moved on to some other things. So we'll talk a bit more about what he's doing at Reimagine Well and My Bridge for Life. Roger, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Roger. Bob. It's great to be here. It's funny, all the conversation about VR headsets, which back in the day at Imagineering were HMDs. And the first VR attraction we worked on was back in the 1990s.
Wow.
When, at Disney Quest, where the Marvel Comics villains were able to be battled with lightsabers in a VR attraction that required lowering the headsets on cables because they were so heavy, and the person playing the game leaning against a bench because the equilibrium loss was so crazy while you were standing with a VR headset and a lightsaber in your hand that people were falling over. So we needed to clip them into benches. But yeah, it's interesting to watch the technology develop and interesting to see the latest rev. And it'll be interesting to see if it truly takes off, because I have developer kits in my garage back from the 1990s.
That's true. There's a big question about that with VR. It's sort of, what's the use case, and how often will we use it? Apparently, the current generation of HMDs, they're used about 2 times a month on average, which is not very exciting. But
and
that could change.
What we've learned in the clinical setting, particularly with pediatric patients, is about a third of the time they don't want to put one on. So unless a VR headset is required, when we do our medical applications, we have them available on a computer screen as well as on the VR headset, because about a third of the patients will put the VR headset on and say, nope, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And in the clinical setting, you don't want to deny a patient the ability to do a clinical experience just because they don't want to put a headset on.
No, I agree, Roger. But I think that, a lot of that is us learning about how to build these units so they're comfortable and accessible for everybody. There was reports early on about people getting nauseous using VR headsets and so forth. A lot of that is about GPU processing speeds, and it's about the quality of the screens, right? And each of those are improving exponentially over time. So I assume that we're going to address those things. And I also think that, I was having this debate the other day with one of my crypto DeFi friends here in Bangkok. And he was saying, really, do you think people are going to wear augmented reality glasses? And I said, well, you have to look at, this is the futurist angle, right? Thinking like a futurist is, if you look at the development of computing over the last 60 years, computers were 80 years, extremely sophisticated pieces of equipment that required, high degrees of engineering capability just to utilize. In the old days, we did punch cards to program, computers, and then we got a keyboard, but we had a printer, no screens, and there were green screens, and there was GUIs and so forth. But, if you follow that trajectory of computing, then computing's getting more powerful, much, much easier to use, but the ultimate ease of use is computing that is just embedded in the world around you. And that's clearly where technologies like augmented reality and voice-based smart speakers and things like that, self-driving cars, is taking us into this world of, where we're immersed in computing. And so I think, it's not a question of, if, like, I don't think there's a scenario where AR just doesn't happen. You know, I mean, as a futurist, I think it's just a matter of when we get the tech so it's compelling for people to use.
It might be in the car as a heads-up display.
Yeah, it's also a question of what the application is that requires the technology. So, you know, from my experience at Imagineering and from my point of view in my teaching at CalArts, you know, with students who are looking at the class is called Designing Deep Futures. It's the use case that needs to exist before the technology is appropriate. I mean, I can date myself and tell you that, you know, one of my very first come to Jesus technology moments was the 1964 World's Fair, seeing what I believed at that moment as an 8-year-old kid, Abraham Lincoln, come back to life and talk to me from a stage in Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln at that World's Fair. The technology was as rudimentary and clunky and horrible, right, as you can imagine for audio animatronics in that time. But the story and the use of that technology was so emotionally captivating that it drove the audio animatronic, you know, future for the next 40 years of the Walt Disney Company.
That's a really good point. It's if the story's good enough, we get immersed in it and we almost persuade ourselves. You know, we'll suspend disbelief long enough to get into the narrative, and the imagination fills in the gaps.
It does. And the technology grows along the way. You know, about the time we met, I was piloting an attraction at Imagineering with a free-swimming animatronic dolphin. That was circa 1999 with Edge Innovations using the technology, some of the technology they had developed for films like Free Willy and Flipper and The Abyss. And we won't realize that attraction with the version 3.0 version of animatronic swimming creatures until 2025. You know, part of what I really focus on in my teaching as well is really walking students how to keep their vision and their passion for that vision alive, right? Because, you know, we've been around long enough to know a vision of the future doesn't materialize tomorrow. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
And you've got to sustain it. And
you might have the vision, but you might not be able to realize the vision, right? That's the challenge. You got to keep that flame alive.
Exactly. You've got to. And, you know, and so, you know, it's been interesting, you know, the Edge Innovations project with this dolphin, which laid dormant for a decade and a half, you know, came back to life just before pandemic, but it won't be realized. We finally have a contract with a city in the United States of America, right, to do an animatronic free swimming attraction there for their city centennial in 2025. But the goal of that project, you know, and the passion of that project comes from wanting to be able to save species on the planet as they begin to get, you know, and to change the dynamics of the marine park industry to enable it to be successful and profitable again.
Now, Roger, you have so many experiences that we want to go through in a sequence so our audience can follow. And, you know, you've been a director, you've designed theme park rides, you were at Disney Imagineering. Then you launched this business, Reimagine Well, where you're working in a healthcare setting, but in a way, kindling the imagination. Of course, now you're a teacher also at CalArts. Before we go into your whole chronology and all the lessons you've learned, we would be very interested to hear all that. But we're going to go to a break in a moment. And before we do, we have this thing we like to do on the show where we ask you a series of quick questions. So here's just a quick response about the things that inspired you to think about the future. That's one of the things we like to do on this show is help our audience understand ways to think about the future. And so your inspirations are going to inspire other people. And this is the part that Brett likes to do. So Brett, are you ready for the rapid fire question?
Here's the quick fire lightning round. Roger, what was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to? TV, books, movies?
2001, the original movie in the theater.
I just watched that again. It's just a masterpiece of filmmaking, really.
Planet of the Apes, somewhere around the same time.
Very cool. What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
The printing press.
That's a good one. Yep. Name a futurist or an entrepreneur that has personally influenced you.
Frances Arnold.
Who?
I've not heard of Frances Arnold.
Yeah, she's French. She is head of bioengineering at Caltech. She's a recipient of the Draper Award and a recent Nobel recipient.
Wow. I should have heard of her.
We'll have to find her and get her on the show.
Actually, on the biotech stuff, I'd love to have Hugh Herr on as well. The MIT Harvard roboticist that built himself new legs. That would be great. Roger, what's the best prediction that you've heard a futurist or an entrepreneur make?
Andrew Hessel is a pretty close friend, and the idea that synthetic biology will enable us to approach cleaning the environment in ways we'd never before considered makes me feel hopeful.
He's a good friend of mine, and we had him on the show in one of our very first episodes because we think synthetic biology is super important for the future. It touches so many parts of the economy and society. So I share that. Okay, let's break right now. So we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Futurists with me, Rob Tercek, and my co-host, Brett King. And this week, our guest is Roger Holzberg, who's going to share with us a whole bunch about Disney Imagineering and the application of what he learned there to the healthcare field. So stay tuned. We'll be right back in a minute.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, with my good pal, Rob Tercek. This week's guest, Roger Holzberg, is joining us. He has some really interesting history from the days at Disney Imagineering. Actually, maybe to kick this segment off, Roger, can you talk about anything you worked on at Imagineering in the early days that is now reality that you're really proud of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Prior to going to Disney, I had done some IMAX movies. The Living Sea would probably be the one I'm most proud of. And I went to Disney, and one of the first projects I had the opportunity to work on was Soarin' over California. So I know we all like to talk about VR. At Imagineering, virtual reality is not limited to a head-mount display and a high-def screen strapped to your face. In Soarin' over California, we boom 187 people up into an inverted OmniMax dome with full surround sound, smell, motion base, and everything else. And that's about as immersive an experience as is possible, I believe. And it also delivers on the Disney Imagineering promise to develop experiences for guests from the age of 5 to 105. A 5-year-old can ride that ride with a 105-year-old right next to them and have extraordinary experiences. So, in terms of immersion, I think that's an attraction I had the opportunity to work on that is the most immersive. The one of the attractions, the Millennium Celebration, I was one of the creative directors on at Walt Disney World back when we believed Y2K was going to end the world and airplanes were going to fall out of the sky. The most inspiring thing I think I ever got to do with the Walt Disney Company was working on Millennium Village, which was a prototypical world without borders. Pre 9/11, we never could have done that today, right? Pre 9/11, we had Israel and Saudi Arabia next to one another as countries in Millennium Village, with young people from their countries sharing their gifts to the world. And there was the technology which was utilized in the storytelling and the experience was extraordinary across the pavilion. So that was one. But the one that, I want to touch on, because it was a part of my transition into healthcare, was an attraction I got to work on called Turtle Talk with Crush. There was a desire to do something new and different at the Living Seas Pavilion at Epcot. Disney was in the beginning of, what became the acquisition of Pixar. Finding Nemo had come out and was a huge hit, and turning Crush the Turtle into a vector that could be animated in real time with guests was the first real time use of vector technology, with guests in a high def, fully realized Pixar quality animation world.
Well, Roger, you're telling us a little bit about your experiences making different attractions. And what I'm hearing you say is that there's a methodology at Disney Imagineering, which is like an R&D lab. And that methodology combines two things. It takes advantage of technologies that are coming to fruition. You sort of have to time it just right so that the technology is ready for the mass scale, for the public. But at the same time, you also take into account real world events. You mentioned, for instance, reference to 9/11 and how that might change the expectation of the audience. But you also mentioned, for instance, Finding Nemo. So, a big Disney feature film that's coming that will also change or recalibrate user experience or expectation. So it's this combination of like the technology that's ready and then also the real world and what that's doing to people's experience and expectation. Is that how it works there?
It's always about the storytelling and the experience design, and to some degree, never about the technology, right? Disney always wants to be at the bleeding edge of technology. But as you know, by the time you develop and launch an attraction, that technology is probably 18 months old, right? So, when you think of a ride like Soarin' over California, the concept prototype for that ride was actually built out of an erector set on the ride designer's dining room table and brought into Imagineering and demoed, with booming arms that were, twisted together out of an erector set. The Turtle Talk with Crush technology that fueled the attraction was an adaptation of the Waldo animators tools that were used at Pixar. I think it is and I find that what I do now at Reimagine Well, we never think about inventing a technology, but we absolutely are utilizing existing technologies to create patient experiences that are healing in a clinical sense, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you talked about the iPhone a minute ago. In iPhone 1.0, there wasn't a lot of new technology. Yeah. There was the right package for the right technology with the right model, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, and in terms of my thinking about the future, it's not about inventing technology. It's about inventing the right experience for the right audience at the right time.
Now, you've made reference to healthcare a couple of times. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Reimagine Well and your journey from Disney to the healthcare field?
I will. So I got diagnosed with cancer in 2004, and I'm not at all shy about it. It was thyroid cancer. It was a big wake-up call on the eve of my 50th birthday. Probably the greatest gift the Walt Disney Company ever gave to me was the Senior Executive Physical Program, which I could go into, and say something's off. I don't know what it is, but my mom died of cancer, and my cousin died when we were teenagers of cancer, and I'm pretty freaked out. And let's keep looking until we find it. And that program enabled my physician to order a full body MRI, and early detection is a great tool, right?
Wow.
My family was my family was in the we're all doctors. My dad wanted me to go to med school. My FU in the late 1960s was, no, I'm going to art school. Right. After that diagnosis, he came back and said, well, maybe you ought to rethink that. How about some volunteer work? So for the next 4 years, I pulled together a group of Imagineering colleagues, and we did a lot of volunteer work. And one of the things we did was take the Turtle Talk with Crush attraction, right, and do a scaled down version of it and brought it to Children's Hospital of Orange County. So suddenly Crush the Turtle was no longer this goofball surfer dude, right, who was doing bits and talking a little bit about planetary protection and marine animals at Epcot. Suddenly Crush the Turtle was a comfort friend for pediatric patients. And I learned what a child life specialist was, that there was a job where people's careers were spent normalizing children's lives when they were in treatment. I learned what distraction therapy was, that there had been studies done on what is called distraction therapy for decades, and that there were real clinical results to it. It was an aha moment, right? I then did some volunteer work again with I kind of thought of them as my Imagineering cancer hit squad, right? We redid the lobby at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Again, a whole different wave of how to do experience design in a hospital. And then we did a support platform for livestrong.org, and I ended up doing the media for the launch of livestrong.com. All of that got bubbled up to a level to get me recruited to be the first creative director at the National Cancer Institute. Yeah. So,
is it right for me to say, Roger, that you took your experience at Disney and you found a way to maybe redirect it to help people who are going through traumatic healthcare challenges and in a way kind of comfort them or even inspire them and give them hope? Is that the story? Is that your trajectory?
That's where it started, and that's very accurate. And I can tell you, when I was in treatment, I watched paint peel off of walls, in a hospital that was built circa 1980. I also was a little bit crazy in my own personal health plan and decided I would start doing triathlons a year out of cancer treatment. Anyway. And I was swimming off of the coast of Malibu. At one point, thinking about the fact that I was watching paint peel off of walls. And for me, growing up in South Florida on the water, being in the ocean is my healing place. Mm-hmm. And being around, and I was swimming with a buddy, and a female dolphin and a pup popped up about 10 feet away from us. And I went, this is the most healing experience I can imagine. Why wasn't I here when I was in treatment for cancer? Right. And the light bulb went off. Wait a minute. You actually could have been here. You used to make rides for Disney, right? There's no reason you couldn't have been here in every way, but physically. And that's where the concept of an infusionarium was born, right? So, so I'll bring you up to speed a little bit. The attraction Turtle Talk with Crush was done at Children's Hospital of Orange County. I, by this time, was working at the National Cancer Institute, redoing the pediatric and adolescent parts of cancer.gov, our federal cancer website, and taking the Institute into new media and social media. And the clinical director for Children's Hospital of Orange County came to me and said, does your company only do work for the government, or do you do work with hospitals as well? And Leonard Sender is my co-founder of Reimagine Well. And I said, well, why are you asking? He said, I've got a problem that I'd like you to try and help solve. And I said, great. I love problem solving. Can I bring a few of my former Imagineering colleagues down to Children's Hospital of Orange County, and we'll meet with some of your clinical teams and your oncology social workers and child life specialists, and let's do an Imagineering style brainstorm. And we did. And the problem we were looking at was pediatric and adolescent young adult segment of cancer is the AYA segment is a really challenging segment. It's 15 to 39-year-olds. He said, pediatric and those patients, they get diagnosed, they get depressed, they get anxious, they retreat from their community, and that depression in combination with chemotherapy just doesn't mix well. How can we change the chemotherapy infusion experience? And the concept we came up with an Imagineering style brainstorm where there's no such thing as a bad idea, was the Infusionarium, where patients direct their own healing experience. So, this is, some of my former Disney colleagues say it must be incredibly...
What's the tech behind the Infusionarium? Because you haven't defined that.
Yeah, good question. It's video. It's video and wraparound screens.
So, there's been some really good work done with PTSD treatment in VR, and so it'd be interesting, to see. I mean, pain management as well. They say that, if people are in VR and they're experiencing pain, that they can get relief from pain and things like that. I think there's a lot of potential for the tech. Just coming back to, did you ever hear the theory that Crush the turtle is high? No, because this is true. Because sea turtles eat jellyfish, right? And the jellyfish, they don't hurt the sea turtles, but it intoxicates them. So, when he's totally Crush is there, there's a theory that Crush is like a real surfer dude,
Yes.
I do want to get into some of the, in terms of the process for Imagineering. You talked about Crush the Turtle, how it's helped in the process with the healing, but in terms of that forecasting element, you said Disney doesn't invent tech, but what they do is they utilize a lot of that tech. So, in the Imagineering process, it sounds like you guys are mapping out stuff you want to do and execute on, but you're waiting for the tech to catch up sometimes. Is that sort of an accurate way of describing the way that sort of forecasting internally goes on?
Sure, I think it's accurate. In the healthcare world, there are some pretty extraordinary restrictions sometimes for the tech. So, we considered with our initial Infusionarium builds whether it would make sense to use a head mount display as a part of it, and infection control, right, becomes a massive part of the equation, particularly with patients who are immunocompromised because they're on chemotherapy. That's really just important. The act of taking a headset off of one person and putting it on another person could literally kill them. Right. Wow. So, so there's a number of other different kinds of considerations that go into the requirements for a project. But, so for the Infusionarium experience, it was screen-based, but there were other healing modalities that we developed and work in where we do use head mount displays and VR, and one of them in particular requires it. Super fascinating, and the study is going on, a project that we developed, again, in a similar way, and we always do the Imagineering brainstorm. We at Reimagine Well, we never say that it's our job to say to patients what will be healing for them. Our job is to listen to them and give them what they believe will be healing on a patient level.
So, Roger, you've talked about this brainstorming approach a few times now. How does it differ from other organizations that you've worked with? What makes the brainstorming approach at Imagineering unique? Is it the people? Is there a methodology to it? How does it differentiate?
In the simplest way, it's from the bottom up, as opposed to from the top down. You talked in your opening, about some technologies that are coming out, from some other companies, some VR technologies. I would say it comes from the bottom up. When I first went to the National Cancer Institute, I went to the fellow who was my boss at the time, and we're still great friends. And I said, I want to do an institute-wide creative pitch-in where every single person at this institute can literally pitch an idea on a single piece of paper for 3 minutes, as to how cancer.gov, as the gold standard of cancer treatment and research on planet Earth, could better achieve its mission. And he said, it'll never work. They'll never do it. It'll never happen. I can tell you some of the best ideas came out of a healthcare worker in the cafeteria at one of the National Institutes of Health campuses, right? Some of the most important ideas came out of one of the drivers, right? Who said,
the people on the front line are the ones who really know what the customer is dealing with. Roger,
exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about your work with CalArts, because now at this stage in your life, you're transmitting what you know to a new generation, which is a very hopeful and positive thing. What are the lessons you're teaching CalArts students about world building, and why is that so important?
Well, it's important because if there is a future, the young minds of today are going to invent it, right?
Yeah, they get to clean up the mess we're leaving behind, right?
Yeah, and CalArts gave me an incredible opportunity to essentially use my classes as studios. So I teach 2 classes there. In the Healthcare by Design class, we partner with a hospital, and I have the class work as the Blue Sky Lab to develop a pilot to solve a real world problem in a hospital. And we've wound up with 3 different programs that have been implemented into hospital networks out of that lab. The most fun one is an AR app designed to get patients out of bed and ambulatory post-op as soon as possible. It is in the pediatric world again, right? But yeah, it worked incredibly well. And multiple times CalArts has then given a grant to take the pilot and turn it into the product for the hospital. So that's happened twice.
So your students, in a way, are your own Imagineering force. You're turning the students into Imagineers.
Yes, my dream is that the reason I want to teach is to empower and educate younger minds to take over the vision of that I have empowered them to become passionate about.
Cool.
The most exciting thing is when my students graduate from CalArts, and about 6 times now I've gotten to hire them to work on projects because, they are thinking about, they've either been a part of developing the concept, and then it makes sense to bring them on to help do the implementation. I learned early on that if you give young minds the tools to build with, they'll come up with solutions that you never imagined.
Okay, that's a good jumping off point for us, because on this show, one of the things we'd love to close with is a vision of the future, the far future. And now I want you to put on your futurist thinking cap, if you will. Give us a scenario for
Roger.
Give us a scenario for 20 years out, 30 years out. What do you think the students that you're teaching today, what do you envision that they'll be implementing in a quarter of a century?
Boy, I'm going to quote directly from some of the finals that were delivered just a couple of months ago, and they're very different than what we might have expected. One of them very clearly was about a green food project, right? That essentially takes a permaculture approach, to food production and re-engineers the agriculture systems of the world back to a localized permaculture approach, right? Another one, though, was a hysterical campaign called Traitor Joe's, which began with a social media campaign showing Trader Joe's that they weren't living up to their environmental commitments or responsibilities and embarrassing them to do the right thing. Another one which I fell in love with, and it was inspired by. So Andrew was a guest speaker, Andrew Hessel, at my last Designing Deep Futures class. Was how clothing and utilization of synthetic biology would scale to cleansing, to reducing global warming, right, through everything from eradication of plastics to changing the composition of the air. So, I mean, those are some of the far distant, thoughts.
So they all have in common this notion of preserving the environment, maybe being more efficient with the environment or more efficient with what we're growing. That's quite interesting. So sustainability is clearly a big theme among your students.
The cliff yes, it's very interesting. I brought in, a longevity specialist in my first class and learned that at least the young student minds of today actually don't want to hear from the immortality folks, right? That is not that's not the cliff that they're looking at. The cliff that they're looking at is the end of the environment and the environmental holocaust. And that seems to be where they're focusing. And they're focusing on it from a food sustainability and from an environmental sustainability, utilizing everything from synthetic biology to holding corporations accountable for their pledges.
Very cool. Well, this has been a very fun and interesting conversation, and I'd certainly love to continue talking to you about inventing deep futures. That seems like an inspirational project. What words of advice do you have for folks who are listening? If you're able to give them any advice about how to think better about the future, what would you encourage them to do?
I would encourage them to begin by looking back at the aha moments they had as young people, making notes about those, documenting why they are incredibly passionate about those things, because that passion and that commitment and that emotional connection to what you believe is important as a young person is what sustains you to be able to achieve those things when you have the ability to do it.
Right on. Well, Roger, it's been a great pleasure to reconnect with you on the show. Thanks for joining us here on the Futurists. It's been interesting to hear your trajectory from Disney into the healthcare world, and now as an educator as well at Cal Arts. Our guest this week has been Roger Holzberg. Really very fun to have you back with us, and thanks for sharing those insights about Disney Imagineering and that process.
Where can people find out more information about the work you're doing, Roger?
Well, the Wikipedia page is actually fairly good. I'd say it's, so there's a Wikipedia page, Roger Holzberg, and the Reimagine Well website has got our full product suite, both our Infusionarium immersive products as well as our VR-based clinical products on it.
Right on. Well, thanks for joining us. And folks, you've been listening to The Futurists with myself and Brett King as our co-hosts. And our engineer, we want to thank Kevin Hirschhorn, our producer, Elizabeth Severance, and the whole crew at Provoke Media. They've been very helpful in getting the show going. And thanks to everybody who's listening, who's sent in suggestions, questions, advice, ideas, opinions, people who disagree. We love the dialogue. It's been a lively chat, and we welcome it. And thank you all for those who have been encouraging us with 5-star reviews. That really helps people discover the show. And the growth of the show has been going very, very well. So we want to encourage everyone listening, if you wouldn't mind, if you like the show and you want other people to find it, please do stop and give us a 5-star review, whether that's on Apple or Spotify or any other podcast service. And so for all the folks here at Provoke, we want to thank you for listening. Thank you, Roger, for joining us. And we will see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.